Traverse Station orbited a neutron star that painted the void in colors that shouldn't exist. Radiation bleeding through protective shields in violets and greens that made observation decks popular with tourists, and deeply uncomfortable for anyone who understood what they were actually seeing. Naira avoided the observation decks. She avoided most places where people gathered, which made working on a station with 12,000 permanent residents and 30,000 transients an exercise in calculated invisibility. Third shift helped. The corridors emptied after 200 station time, most species following circadian rhythms that demanded sleep during dark cycles, even when darkness was artificial and maintained by lighting controls. Naira worked those hours, assigned to maintenance sectors that other technicians marked as low priority, in reports that really meant someone else's problem eventually. Tonight she was in Sector 7 Delta, a maintenance corridor running behind the commercial district, where shops sold overpriced souvenirs to species who traveled light years to stand in the same generic retail spaces they could have found on their homeworlds. The power grid here had been fluctuating for weeks, brownouts that annoyed merchants and created safety violations that colony administration politely ignored, because fixing old systems cost money nobody wanted to spend. The access tunnel was barely large enough for her frame, forcing Naira to crawl on her belly while her tool kit scraped against corroded metal overhead. Her bioluminescence provided the only light, patterns flowing across her skin in ways that made her wince even though nobody could see. The glow was uneven, brighter on her left side than her right, creating asymmetrical shadows that reminded her of every insult she'd ever internalized. Among her people, the Luminari, beauty was measured by the patterns you produced. Symmetrical displays that flowed like water, brightness that could illuminate chambers, complexity that spoke to intelligence and breeding. The most admired Luminari created cascading auroras across their skin, mathematical precision in every pulse of light. Naira's patterns flickered, sparked irregularly, concentrated on the wrong side of her body like someone had installed her bioluminescence incorrectly and forgotten to distribute it evenly. Her bone structure was equally wrong, pronounced ridges along her jawline and temples that disrupted the smooth planes Luminari aesthetics preferred. She'd learned to live with it, learned to take jobs where beauty didn't matter, where competence was measured in repaired systems rather than admired patterns. She'd been on Traverse Station for 3 years, saving money to send back to her family on the homeworld, existing in the spaces between other people's lives. The circuit breaker she was working on finally yielded to her efforts, clicking into reset position with a satisfying chunk. Her diagnostic scanner showed power flow normalizing through this junction, but the main fault was still somewhere upstream in the ancient conduit system. She'd been tracing it for 2 weeks, working backwards through decades-old infrastructure that had been patched and repatched until the original design was more suggestion than specification. Hello. Maintenance is supposed to be working in this sector. Don't want to get in your way. Naira froze. Third shift was supposed to be empty. Nobody in these corridors except her and the occasional drunk tourist who'd gotten catastrophically lost. The voice was speaking universal standard with an accent she recognized from cultural training, human, probably male by the vocal register, coming from the main corridor outside the access tunnel. She could stay silent, pretend she hadn't heard, wait for him to leave, but professional responsibility was one of the few things she had left. I'm in the access tunnel, working on circuit breaker panel 7. Need any help? I'm supposed to repair the power grid, but I figured I'd check in with whoever's already working before I start pulling panels apart. Naira extracted herself from the tunnel with movements that were anything but graceful. Elbows scraping metal, tool kit catching on protrusions, her patterns flickering with anxiety the whole time. She emerged covered in dust and immediately aware that her bioluminescence was displaying all her discomfort in irregular pulses that any Luminari would read as inadequacy. The human was tall, wearing a station engineering jumpsuit with tool pouches that suggested he actually knew how to use the equipment instead of just carrying it for show. His skin was brown. Humans had bewildering variety in coloring, and his hair was cropped short in a style that seemed practical rather than aesthetic. He held a diagnostic scanner in one hand and was looking at her with expression she couldn't quite read. "I'm Jackson Torres," he said, extending a hand in the human greeting gesture Naira had seen but never performed. "Station engineering sent me to track down whatever's causing the power fluctuations. Your maintenance, right?" She touched his hand briefly, the contact feeling strange without any exchange of light patterns. "Naira, maintenance third shift. I've been tracing the fault for 2 weeks. I think it's in the old conduit junction, near sector intersection." 2 weeks? His eyebrows rose, human facial expressions were endlessly complicated. "That's some serious dedication. Want to show me what you found? 2 heads are better than 1. Even if one of those heads belongs to a human who's still learning his way around alien electrical systems." Naira's patterns flickered uncertainly. She usually worked alone, preferred it that way, avoided situations where others might notice her irregular displays. But turning down help would be unprofessional, and the work needed doing regardless of her personal discomfort. "The junction is 30 meters upstream," she said, pointing down the access tunnel. "It's cramped, we'll have to crawl." "I've crawled through worse, lead the way." They worked for 3 hours, tracing circuits through infrastructure that predated current safety codes. Jackson asked good questions, demonstrated actual understanding of power distribution systems, and managed to wedge himself into spaces that really weren't designed for human proportions. At one point they had to work back-to-back in a junction chamber barely large enough for both of them, their combined body heat making the air thick and uncomfortable. Naira's bioluminescence provided most of the light. Jackson had a headlamp, but kept it dim to avoid glare in the confined space. She was acutely aware of her patterns reflecting off metallic surfaces, displaying her anxiety and concentration in ways she couldn't hide. Any luminary would see immediately how uneven her glow was, how the patterns sparked instead of flowing. But Jackson just kept working, occasionally asking her to shift position so her light illuminated a particular junction better. At one point, when she was concentrating hard on a particularly corroded connection, he looked up from his scanner and said casually, "That's really cool, by the way. The light thing, it's like wearing your thoughts on the outside." Naira's pattern stuttered to near darkness. Nobody commented on her bioluminescence except to point out its flaws. She didn't know how to respond, didn't understand if he was being sincere or making subtle mockery the way some species did. She started, then stopped. "It's just biology. Electromagnetic emissions from specialized cells in our dermal layer." "Sure, biology, but also art. I mean, look." He gestured at her arm where patterns were pulsing with her heartbeat. "It changes with what you're feeling, right? So it's like emotional expression made visible. That's fascinating." "It's irregular," Naira said quietly. "My patterns don't flow correctly. Among my people it's considered." She trailed off. Jackson was looking at her with what seemed like genuine confusion. "Considered what?" "Flawed." "Huh?" He returned attention to the circuit panel. "Well, humans have learned that most flaws are just arbitrary standards that make people feel bad about natural variation. Your patterns look fine to me. Interesting, actually. More personality than if everything was perfectly symmetrical." Naira didn't respond. Couldn't respond. She'd spent years accepting that her patterns were inadequate, that she failed to meet basic luminary aesthetic standards. Having a human casually dismiss those standards as arbitrary felt like suggesting gravity was optional. They worked in silence for a while, finally identifying the main fault, a corroded junction that would need complete replacement. Jackson made notes on his scanner while Naira calculated what parts they'd need and how long repairs would take. "This is going to be several more shifts worth of work," she said. The junction needs replacement, but we can't shut down power to the whole sector. We'll have to reroute through backup circuits first. Sounds like we'll be working together for a bit then. Jackson smiled. Humans showed teeth when expressing friendliness, which had taken Naira months to stop finding threatening. That okay with you? I can request different assignment if you'd rather work alone. No, it's... Naira's patterns flickered with something that might have been pleasure at the thought of continued company, which immediately made her embarrassed. It's fine. 2 heads, like you said. Great. I'll put in the parts requisition tonight, should have everything by tomorrow's shift. He started backing out of the junction chamber, then paused. Hey, Naira, thanks for not making this weird. Some species get uncomfortable working with humans. We're still pretty new to Galactic community, and apparently we smell wrong or breathe wrong or something. You smell fine, Naira said, then immediately regretted it because that sounded strange. I mean, not offensive. Humans smell like warm metal and something organic I don't have vocabulary for. Jackson laughed, a sound that was surprisingly pleasant. That's probably the most unique compliment I've ever received. Smells like warm metal. I'll take it. They finished documenting the fault and crawled back out to the main corridor. The shift was ending. Early morning crew would be arriving soon. Naira felt the familiar anxiety about being seen, about having her patterns on display when other Luminari might be present in the corridors. But Jackson was still talking, oblivious to her discomfort. Same time tomorrow. I work 3rd shift most nights anyway. Something about human circadian rhythms making night work easier for us than some species. Yes, same time. I'll start the prep work on rerouting backup circuits. Perfect. See you tomorrow then, Naira. He headed toward the main corridors, tool kit slung over his shoulder, whistling something that was probably human music. Naira stood alone in the corridor, her patterns flickering with confused emotions. Nobody ever asked to work with her again. Nobody casually called her patterns interesting, as if that was something positive. Nobody treated her irregular bioluminescence as anything other than polite embarrassment to be diplomatically ignored. She hurried back to her quarters before shift change could fill the corridors with people who might see her and judge what they saw. Her room was small and cramped, oldest habitat ring, cheapest rates, but it was hers. She dimmed her patterns to minimal glow and sat on her sleeping platform, replaying the evening. Interesting, Jackson had said. More personality than if everything was perfectly symmetrical. Naira looked at her arm, watching patterns pulse unevenly across her skin. Bright on the left, dimmer on the right, sparking irregularly where they should flow smoothly. By every Luminari standard, they were inadequate, flawed, wrong. But maybe, a small voice whispered in her mind, maybe one human thought they were interesting. She told herself it didn't mean anything. Humans didn't understand Luminari aesthetics. He was probably just being polite. Tomorrow they'd work together again, and he'd realize how truly irregular her patterns were, and he'd make excuses to request different assignment. But that night, for the first time in years, she dreamed of glowing without shame. The parts requisition came through faster than expected, apparently mentioning safety violations in commercial sector, motivated colony administration more effectively than routine maintenance requests. Jackson met her in Sector 7 Delta at the start of 3rd shift, carrying components that looked complex even by Luminari standards. Got everything we need, he announced cheerfully. Plus some extras because I've learned that replace 1 component usually becomes replace 6 components. And why is this other thing also broken about 3 hours into any repair job? They spread tools and parts across the corridor floor, planning their approach. The work required coordinating live circuit rerouting while replacing corrupted junctions without causing brownouts that would alert colony administration to exactly how dangerous their repair strategy was. Technically, Jackson said while reading safety protocols, we're supposed to have 3 people minimum for this kind of work. 1 on primary controls, 1 on backup systems, 1 on safety monitoring. We have two people. Yeah, well, colony administration has historically demonstrated that safety regulations are more suggestions than requirements when it comes to actually funding proper staffing. He grinned. So we improvise. I'll handle primary controls if you take backup systems. They worked well together, Naira discovered. Jackson's approach to problem solving was creative in ways Luminari training didn't emphasize. He found solutions in unexpected places, combined systems that weren't designed to interact, and maintained running commentary that ranged from technical observations to increasingly absurd stories about previous repair disasters. There was this one time on Earth Orbital Station, he said while routing backup power, when I was supposed to replace a coolant pump in the agricultural ring. Simple job, right? Except the pump was installed backwards. Someone had misread the schematic during original construction. So when I disconnected it, all the coolant drained into the cucumber beds. Naira's patterns brightened, with amusement despite herself. The plants survived. The plants thrived. Turns out coolant fluid has nutrients that cucumbers love. We ended up with the most successful crop yield in station history, and a very angry facilities manager who couldn't decide whether to promote me or space me. She found herself laughing, actually laughing, at his stories. Her bioluminescence responded to her amusement, brightening in patterns that sparked across her skin like fireworks. They were irregular, asymmetrical, fundamentally wrong by Luminari standards. Jackson noticed, watching the patterns with open fascination. Like fireworks, he said. That's what it looks like when you laugh. Like sparks dancing across your skin. Naira's immediate instinct was embarrassment. Her laugh patterns were especially irregular, breaking into random bursts rather than flowing smoothly the way beautiful Luminari laughter looked. She started to dim them to suppress the response. Don't, Jackson said quietly. Don't hide it, it's beautiful. Her patterns stuttered to near darkness. That word again, beautiful. In Luminari culture it was sacred, reserved for someone whose presence genuinely inspired admiration. You didn't use it casually, didn't throw it around as empty compliment. You shouldn't say that, she managed. Say what? That your patterns are beautiful. Among my people, beautiful is sacred word. You only use for someone whose presence inspires genuine admiration. Jackson met her eyes. Then I used it correctly. The power junction they were working on sparked, forcing attention back to immediate crisis of preventing electrical fire. They spent the next hour in intense focus, routing backup power while replacing corroded components, coordinating movements in the cramped junction chamber with precision that came from growing trust in each other's competence. But Naira's mind kept circling back to his words. Beautiful, genuine admiration. No one had ever spoken to her that way, gently, sincerely, without fear or mockery. During their break, sitting on the corridor floor surrounded by equipment and the faint smell of electrical burns, Jackson pulled out human food, something wrapped in what looked like processed grain. Want one? Fair warning. Humans have no idea if this is poisonous to Luminari, so proceed at your own risk. What is it? Technically, it's a burrito. Practically, it's whatever the station cafeteria had available wrapped in a tortilla and heated until approximately edible. Naira accepted it cautiously. Her species could process most carbon-based foods, though the results were sometimes unpredictable. She took a small bite, tasted something spicy and complex, decided it probably wouldn't kill her. It's good. Liar, but I appreciate the diplomatic response. They ate in comfortable silence. Naira found herself relaxing in ways she rarely did around others, her patterns settling into steady glow rather than anxious flickering. Jackson seemed content with silence, not pushing for conversation when quiet sufficed. Can I ask something personal? He said finally. Naira tensed. Yes. Why third shift? You're clearly competent. Supervisor comments in the team logs are always positive about your technical skills. You could work prime shifts, get better assignments, more visibility. Why hide out in maintenance corridors nobody cares about? She didn't answer immediately. Her patterns dimmed, cycling through colors that meant discomfort and old shame. I'm not hiding. Okay, I'm just working shifts that match my skills. Naira, you rebuilt a power distribution junction in 3 hours that should have taken 2 days. Your skills match any shift. So why this one? She looked at her hands, watched patterns pulse unevenly across her skin. Because fewer people see me, fewer luminari notice my inadequate patterns, fewer opportunities to be reminded that I fail to meet basic aesthetic standards of my own species. Jackson was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. Who told you your patterns were inadequate? Everyone. Other luminari. My family tries to be kind about it, but they send messages about treatments that might help, procedures that could even out the distribution. Teachers in school always paired me with partners whose patterns could compensate for my irregularity. Potential romantic interests made polite excuses when they saw my full display. So your entire life, people have told you that your natural appearance is wrong. It's not wrong, it's just not beautiful. There are standards. Symmetry, brightness, flow, I fail at all of them. Right, but here's my question. Who decided those were the standards? And why does everyone just accept them? Naira stared at him. That's their cultural standards, beauty standards. Every species has them. Yeah, and every species' beauty standards are arbitrary bullshit designed to make people feel inadequate. Jackson's tone was matter-of-fact, not angry, stating what he apparently considered obvious truth. Humans have done this for centuries. We've told people they're too fat, too thin, wrong skin color, wrong hair texture, wrong facial features. Built entire industries around convincing people their natural bodies are inadequate. So how do humans decide what's beautiful? The healthy ones decide for themselves. They look at someone and think, that person makes me happy to look at, or I appreciate how they carry themselves, or their features are interesting. It's subjective, personal, not some checklist handed down by culture. He turned to face her fully. When I look at you, Naira, I see patterns that are fascinating. They shift and change with your emotions, tell stories in light. I see bone structure that's striking. Those ridges catch light in interesting ways. I see someone who moves with precision and confidence in your technical work, even if you don't have that same confidence in yourself. Her patterns were cascading in colors she rarely produced, golds and blues that danced across her skin in chaotic confusion. I think you're beautiful, Jackson said simply. Not despite your asymmetry, because of it. Because symmetry is boring. Because your patterns have character. Because when you laugh, your light sparks like fireworks, and it's the most interesting thing I've seen on this station. Naira couldn't speak. Her throat felt tight, her patterns cycling through emotions too complex for words. Nobody had ever said these things to her. I avoid observation decks, Naira admitted. Too many people. This one's usually empty during third shift. Just suggest it. No pressure if you'd rather not. Naira's patterns flickered uncertainly. The idea of spending time with someone socially rather than professionally felt dangerous, like setting herself up for inevitable disappointment when he realized how inadequate she really was. But he was looking at her with expression that seemed hopeful rather than obligatory. And maybe, it would be nice to have a friend who didn't see her irregular patterns as something to politely ignore. Tomorrow, she heard herself say. After shift. Tomorrow, Jackson agreed, smiling in that human way that showed teeth. See you then. Naira walked back to her quarters as station lighting shifted to morning cycles. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't hurry to avoid crowds. Her patterns glowed openly, irregular, asymmetrical, sparking instead of flowing. And somehow that felt like enough. Meeting Jackson became routine. After shifts in the observation deck, during breaks in the cafeteria, occasionally in his quarters or hers when station schedules aligned. Naira discovered that spending time with someone who genuinely enjoyed her company was addictive in ways she hadn't anticipated. He made her laugh with stories about human culture and repair disasters. He asked questions about luminary biology and culture without judgment. He treated her irregular patterns as something worthy of attention rather than something to politely ignore. She caught herself looking forward to shifts, not because of the work, but because of the person she'd work alongside. Her patterns brightened more frequently, sparked with colors that meant happiness and anticipation. Coworkers noticed, commented that she seemed more engaged. Her supervisor noted in performance reviews that her team integration had improved significantly. Naira didn't mention that the improvement had nothing to do with team-building exercises and everything to do with one human who'd casually dismantled years of internalized shame with a few honest words. She started taking shifts in more visible areas of the station, volunteered for repair jobs that required interacting with other species, spoke up in team meetings when she had technical insights. The changes were gradual but accumulative. She was becoming visible in ways she'd avoided for years. One evening in the cafeteria, picking up food that was supposedly luminary compatible but tasted like they'd consulted outdated biology texts, she encountered other luminari for the first time since arriving at the station. A couple both beautiful by traditional standards, their patterns flowing in synchronized perfection, sat at a nearby table. The woman noticed her first, stared for a moment before recognition dawned. Naira, Naira of the coastal clan. Dread settled in her chest. Kira had been casually cruel to her years ago on the homeworld, the kind of cruelty that came from someone so secure in their own beauty they could afford to be magnanimous about others' inadequacy. "Hello, Kira. I had no idea you worked on Traverse Station. How long have you been here?" 3 years. 3 years. Kira's patterns conveyed elaborate surprise that seemed performative. "And you never reached out to our luminary community. We have gatherings, cultural events. You should come." It was a trap dressed as invitation. Naira recognized it immediately. "Come so we can remind you of your inadequacy in familiar social contexts." The old Naira would have made excuses, would have dimmed her patterns in automatic shame. But she'd spent months listening to Jackson challenge arbitrary standards. Spent months being treated as beautiful by someone whose opinion she'd come to value. Spent months discovering confidence she didn't know she possessed. "I've been busy with work," she said simply. "But thank you for the invitation." Kira's eyes flicked toward Jackson, who was collecting his own food from the human-compatible dispensary. "You're spending time with humans." "Jackson is my friend. We work together." How progressive. The word carried judgment wrapped in diplomacy. "It's good that you're finding community outside traditional channels, given your circumstances." Jackson approached with his tray, oblivious to the tension. "Hey, Naira. Got stuck behind a Kiksari who couldn't decide between 6 nearly identical protein options. I swear station cafeterias are designed to test patience." "Ready to find seats?" "Circumstances?" he asked, looking at Kira. "Naira's patterns are unique," Kira said with practiced diplomatic kindness. "Not everyone can meet traditional standards. It's admirable that she's adapted." Jackson's expression went carefully neutral. Naira had learned that humans used neutral expressions the way luminari used specific pattern combinations to convey displeasure without explicit insult. Adapted. Interesting word choice. "Well, you understand. When someone's appearance doesn't conform to cultural aesthetics." "I understand that Naira's patterns are beautiful," Jackson interrupted, his tone flat. "Genuinely, objectively beautiful in their complexity and responsiveness. If your culture can't recognize that, that's a failure of your culture, not of her." The cafeteria went silent. Luminari didn't publicly challenge beauty standards. It was deeply taboo, suggesting instability or revolutionary tendencies. Kira's partner stood, his patterns conveying warning. "You're human. You don't understand our culture." "I understand that making people feel inferior about natural variation is harmful regardless of which culture practices it. And I've decided not to participate in systems that do harm. He looked at Naira. Sorry if I'm overstepping, but someone needed to say it. Naira's patterns were cascading in golds and blues, embarrassment mixed with fierce gratitude mixed with something that felt dangerously close to love. You're not overstepping. Kira and her partner left, patterns conveying offense. Other luminari in the cafeteria stared with varying expressions of shock and disapproval. Naira realized that Jackson had just publicly challenged centuries of her species' cultural standards, defending her in ways nobody had ever defended her before. That was, she started, couldn't finish. Going to cause problems probably, Jackson said cheerfully. I have this recurring issue with keeping my mouth shut when people are being unfair. Apologies if I made things harder for you. You didn't make things harder, you made them clearer. They found seats in a corner where fewer species could overhear. Jackson started eating his food with the focus of someone who'd learned to appreciate meals regardless of quality. Naira picked at hers, mind racing through implications of what just happened. Does it bother you? She asked quietly. That my people consider me inadequate, that by our standards I actually do fail aesthetic metrics. Jackson looked at her steadily. Does it bother me that your culture has arbitrary beauty standards that make wonderful people feel inferior? Yes, that bothers me a lot. Does it bother me that you don't meet those standards? No, because the standards are garbage. But what if they're not garbage? What if they reflect genuine aesthetic preferences that most luminari share? What if I'm actually just not beautiful by any objective measure? Naira, there's no such thing as objective beauty. Beauty is always in context of who's looking and what they value. Your patterns are objectively complex. I've watched them shift through dozens of configurations. They're objectively responsive. They change with your emotions in fascinating ways. Whether those objective traits equal beautiful depends entirely on the observer. He paused, choosing words carefully. I find you beautiful. That's not pity or kindness or ignorance. It's honest assessment based on what I value. And what I value is uniqueness, authenticity, character. Your patterns have all of those. They're interesting to watch. They tell stories. They're genuine expressions of who you are. But most luminari don't share your values. Then most luminari are missing out. They're lost. Over the next week, something unexpected happened. Other luminari approached Naira privately, younger ones mostly, asking quiet questions about her friendship with the human, about how she developed confidence to display her patterns publicly, about whether she really believed beauty standards should be challenged. A young luminari named Sella caught her after a shift. I have patterns similar to yours. Uneven, irregular. I've been considering cosmetic treatment, but watching you refuse to hide anymore. It made me wonder if treatment is necessary. Naira realized with shock that her visibility had created ripples. That other luminari who felt inadequate had noticed her confidence and started questioning their own internalized shame. She'd accidentally become a symbol of something she never intended, resistance to arbitrary beauty standards. She talked to Jackson about it that evening in the observation deck, watching neutron star radiation paint the void in impossible colors. I don't know how to be a symbol. I'm just trying to exist without shame. That's exactly what makes you effective, Jackson said. You're not preaching, you're just living. Sometimes that's more powerful than any speech. But what if I fail? What if tomorrow I wake up feeling inadequate again? What if I can't maintain this confidence? Then you have a bad day. Confidence isn't constant, it's something you practice. Some days you'll succeed, some days you'll struggle. That's being alive, not failing. They sat in comfortable silence, watching light shows that defied human and luminari visual processing. Naira's patterns shifted through gentle blues and purples, contentment, trust, something deeper she was afraid to name. What do those colors mean? Jackson asked, noticing her watching him watch her patterns. Contentment, she said carefully, And gratitude, you gave me something I didn't know I needed. What's that? Permission to like myself, to see my patterns as something other than flaws, to believe that maybe beauty isn't about meeting standards, but about being genuine. Jackson's expression softened. Naira, you didn't need my permission for that. It was always yours to claim. Maybe, but you showed me it was possible. That someone could look at me and see beauty instead of flaws. That made me wonder if maybe I'd been looking at myself wrong this whole time. And now I'm trying to look at myself the way you see me. Some days I succeed. Some days I still see failures, but I'm trying. That's all anyone can do. A message arrived on Jackson's comm unit. Station administration wanted to meet with both of them about the cafeteria incident. Apparently, publicly challenging Luminari beauty standards had attracted official attention. They probably want to make sure we're not starting interspecies conflicts, Jackson said, reading the summons. Want me to take full responsibility? Say it was human cultural ignorance. No, Naira said, her patterns brightening with determination she barely recognized as her own. We both go. We both explain. I'm done hiding. Jackson smiled, that human expression that showed teeth in ways that used to seem threatening but now just seemed genuine. That's my girl. Let's go challenge some cultural norms. They left the observation deck together, Naira's irregular patterns glowing openly. Jackson walking beside her like her presence beside him was the most natural thing in the universe. And for the first time in her life, Naira believed that maybe, just maybe, she actually was beautiful. The meeting with station administration turned out to be less disciplinary and more anthropological curiosity. The station director, a Verath whose species valued efficiency over aesthetics, wanted to understand the cafeteria situation, primarily to prevent future conflicts. Cultural sensitivity is essential on Traverse Station. The director explained through translators that rendered clicks into multiple languages simultaneously. We have 73 species coexisting. Public challenges to cultural norms can destabilize community relations. With respect, Naira said, her patterns steady despite her racing heart. Some cultural norms deserve to be challenged. Beauty standards that make people feel inadequate aren't traditions worth preserving just because they're established. The director's antennae twitched, interest or concern Naira couldn't tell. You speak against your own culture. I speak against systems that cause harm. There's a difference. Jackson added, on Earth, we've learned, painfully, over centuries, that cultural practices aren't sacred just because they're traditional. Beauty standards, caste systems, gender restrictions. We've had to challenge all of them to create healthier societies. You compare luminary aesthetics to caste systems. I compare any system that tells people they're inherently inadequate to other harmful hierarchies. The specific implementation varies, but the damage is consistent. The meeting lasted 2 hours. In the end, the director suggested, strongly, that Naira and Jackson might consider leading a station workshop on cross-cultural beauty standards and appreciation of diversity within species. Turn controversy into education, the director said. Demonstrate how interspecies perspectives can challenge harmful assumptions. They left the administration offices and found themselves laughing at the absurdity. We went from don't cause trouble to please teach a class, Jackson said. That's either very progressive or very lazy conflict resolution. Possibly both, Naira agreed, but the workshop idea sparked something. Over the next month, they developed a presentation examining how different species' beauty standards were all arbitrary social constructs. They included examples from human history, how preferences for body types, skin tones, and facial features had changed dramatically across time and culture. They discussed luminary patterns and how emphasizing symmetry ignored the beauty of complexity and variation. They brought in examples from other species, showing how every culture had ways of making its members feel inadequate. The workshop attracted surprising attendance, young members of multiple species who'd struggled with their culture's aesthetic standards. Sella attended, bringing several other luminari whose patterns didn't conform to traditional symmetry. A human woman spoke about Earth's history of colorism and how she'd learned to love her natural skin tone. A Kixari discussed crystalline formations that their culture considered crude, but which they found beautiful. Kira even showed up, slipping into the back of the room with expression Naira couldn't quite read. After the workshop, she approached quietly, her patterns hesitant. "I owe you an apology," Kira said. "The way I spoke to you in the cafeteria was cruel. I've been thinking about why I reacted that way, and I realize I was threatened. Threatened by me, by your confidence, by your refusal to hide or fix yourself. It made me question things I've never questioned before." Kira's patterns shifted to vulnerable admission. "I've spent my entire life maintaining perfect symmetry, creating flawless patterns, meeting every standard. It's exhausting. And watching you just exist without that burden made me realize how much energy I waste trying to be perfect." "I don't have answers," Naira said carefully. "I'm just trying to exist without shame. Some days I succeed, others I struggle. That's more than I've managed." Kira hesitated. "Would you be willing to talk sometime about what it's like to step outside traditional expectations?" They exchanged contact information, something Naira never would have imagined possible months ago. As Kira left, Jackson appeared at her side. "Look at you," he said quietly. "Changing minds, challenging systems, starting conversations. I just told my truth. Other people chose to listen. That's how all the best revolutions begin." 3 months after that first meeting in Sector 7 Delta, Naira stood in front of the station council presenting a proposal. Expanded cultural sensitivity training that challenged species-specific beauty standards and promoted appreciation of diversity within species, not just between them. The council debated for weeks. Traditional luminari representatives opposed it, calling it cultural imperialism and human influence corrupting established traditions. But younger representatives from multiple species supported it, sharing stories of how arbitrary beauty standards had harmed them. The program eventually launched as a pilot with mixed reception. Some embraced it, others resisted. But the conversation had started, made possible because one person chose to stop hiding and one person chose to speak honestly about what he saw. Naira still had days when she felt inadequate, days when her irregular patterns seemed like failures instead of features, days when internalized shame resurfaced despite all her progress, but those days were fewer now. And on one particular day, standing in quarters she now shared with Jackson, because they'd officially partnered, combining human and luminari living preferences in ways that probably violated several station regulations. She looked at her reflection and saw something different than she'd seen her entire life. Her patterns were cascading across her skin, asymmetrical and imperfect, brighter on the left than the right, sparking instead of flowing, irregular by every traditional luminari standard, beautiful. Not despite these things, but because of them. Because they were hers, because they were honest, because they told her story in living light that was unique in all the universe. Jackson emerged from their sleeping area already dressed for his shift. He stopped when he saw her standing before the mirror, her patterns glowing brighter than he'd ever seen them. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm beautiful," Naira said, and realized as she said it that she actually believed it. Not because he'd told her so, though that had helped, but because she decided it was true. "Yeah," Jackson said, moving to stand beside her, his reflection joining hers in the mirror. "You really are. I think I always was, I just couldn't see it." "Well, now you can. What changed?" "You showed me how to look at myself with kindness instead of judgment. How to see variation as interesting rather than flawed. How to claim beauty as something I define rather than something others measure." She turned to face him, her patterns creating auroras across their shared quarters. "Thank you for that. For seeing me when I couldn't see myself. for challenging standards I thought were immutable, for loving me before I learned to love myself. That's what we do, Jackson said simply. We see each other, the rest is just details. Outside their quarters, Traverse Station continued its rotation. 73 species coexisting in imperfect harmony, each bringing their own standards and prejudices, and slowly, very slowly, learning to see beyond them. And in one small corner of that massive structure, a luminary